In the late summer of 1989 in Bakersfield, California, 28-year-old Marina Ramos gathered her two infant daughters and walked out the front door with a man she had recently met. Marina said she was starting fresh and then she left. She was never seen again. Her daughters vanished with her, leaving no note, no phone call, no warning. 36 years later, the truth of that quiet morning would begin to surface. How does a woman disappear with two babies in broad daylight? If this story stays with you, tell us where you're listening from as we begin to uncover what really happened. Bakersfield in the late 1980s was a city shaped by movement. Set in California's Central Valley, it sat between long stretches of farmland and wide highways that carried people in and out every day. The air often smelled of dust and irrigation water. Summer heat settled early and lingered late, pressing down on rooftops and sidewalks alike. By midday, the streets shimmered, and most people retreated indoors if they could. It was the kind of place where people learned to endure, where neighbors looked out for one another quietly without fuss. Churches filled on Sundays, diners opened before sunrise, children still played outside in the afternoons, and most families believed that if something truly dangerous happened, someone would notice. Bakersfield was not a town that expected tragedy to arrive unannounced. This was a time before cell phones, before digital records could be searched in seconds, before police databases spoke easily across state lines. When someone disappeared, there were no electronic trails to follow, no location data, no online accounts frozen in time. There was only silence and whatever memories people carried with them. Marina Ramos lived close to that silence. She was fiercely independent. With dark hair she often pulled back when she was busy and a stubborn streak that made her difficult to guide but impossible to forget. She was a single mother, raising two very young children, trying to hold her life together without much support and very little room for error. Marina did not always make the right choices, but her family never questioned her love for her daughters. Her older child, Elizabeth, was just over a year old. She was learning to walk unsteady but determined, reaching out for furniture, hands, anything that would help her move forward. Jasmine, the baby, was barely more than a month old, still sleeping most of the day, entirely dependent on her mother for warmth and comfort. Earlier that summer, Marina had been arrested for shoplifting and spent a short time in jail. It was not a violent offense, but it disrupted an already fragile life. As they had always done, her family stepped in. While Marina was incarcerated, her cousin Esther took care of the girls. Esther fed them, bathed them, rocked them through the night. Everyone understood the arrangement to be temporary. Marina would be released, she would come back, and life would continue. When Marina returned to retrieve her daughters, she did not come alone. She arrived with a man she introduced as Fernando. She said she had met him recently. She said he was helping her start over. Marina told Esther she was leaving Bakersfield. She said she was moving south to Ontario, California. She said she needed a fresh start. This did not alarm anyone. Marina had talked about leaving before. She had always wanted something better, something different. Her family believed her. They watched as she gathered Elizabeth and Jasmine, carefully settled them into a vehicle, and drove away. That was the last time anyone in her family saw Marina Ramos. At first, there was no panic. Marina was an adult. She had said where she was going. Silence, at least at the beginning, did not feel unusual. Days passed. Then weeks. The phone did not ring. Letters did not arrive. Still, there was an assumption that Marina was somewhere else trying to make a life work on her own terms. But as summer faded and fall arrived, the silence began to feel heavier. Marina's sister, Margarita, wondered why she had not called. Esther replayed that last morning in her mind, searching for something she might have missed. Had Marina seemed rushed, afraid, distracted? Nothing stood out. There was no argument, no goodbye that felt final. Our community knows this moment, that slow shift from patience to worry. The moment when silence stops feeling normal and starts feeling wrong. The hesitation before saying it out loud, afraid that naming the fear might make it real. By the end of that year, Marina Ramos was no longer simply someone who had left town. She was someone who had disappeared. And that quiet realization that something was deeply wrong was only the beginning. The morning Marina Ramos left Bakersfield for the last time did not announce itself as important. There was no sense that history was being made. It was simply another warm day in late summer, the kind where the heat arrived early and stayed long after sunset. Marina woke before the sun had fully climbed, moving quietly so she would not wake the girls too soon. Elizabeth stirred in her crib, letting out a soft sound that was half yawn, half complaint. Jasmine slept on, curled and small, her breath shallow and steady. Marina checked on them both before doing anything else. It was a habit she had never broken. She dressed simply, a light shirt, worn jeans, shoes meant for walking, not for style. There was no suitcase by the door, no obvious sign that she was leaving for good. What she carried could fit easily into the cab of a truck. What she left behind was harder to see. In the kitchen, Marina moved through familiar motions. She rinsed a bottle, she warmed it just enough. She lifted Jasmine carefully, supporting her head, whispering softly as the baby woke. Elizabeth watched from her crib, fingers wrapped around the railing, dark eyes following every movement. Almost ready, Marina murmured more to herself than to anyone else. Esther heard the sounds and came into the room. She would later remember that nothing felt rushed. Marina did not act nervous. She did not pace. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she was doing the right thing. They spoke briefly. Nothing dramatic. Marina repeated that she was leaving town, that she was heading south, that she needed to start over. Esther nodded, listening, trusting. Families like theirs were used to making do, to accepting explanations that came without detail. Elizabeth was dressed in a clean outfit, soft and practical. Jasmine was wrapped snugly, her blanket tucked around her. Marina kissed both girls before lifting them again, one on each hip, in turn adjusting her grip until it felt right. When the man Marina had introduced as Fernando arrived, there was no confrontation. He waited by the vehicle, polite, quiet. He did not linger inside the house. Marina stepped outside with the girls shielding her eyes against the growing light. The door closed behind her. That was the last moment that would ever feel ordinary. At first, no one marked the passing hours. Marina had said she was leaving. She had said where she was going. The day unfolded as days always did. The heat built, cars passed, people went to work. Time moved forward without hesitation. Elizabeth and Jasmine did not know they were leaving their past behind. They were too young to understand the weight of change. Elizabeth was distracted by motion, by the feeling of being lifted and set down. Jasmine slept, waking only when hunger demanded attention. The drive out of Bakersfield took them onto long, straight roads where the land stretched flat and open. Fields gave way to scrub. Towns appeared and disappeared. There was nothing about the journey that stood out to anyone who passed them. A woman with two small children was not unusual. A pickup truck on the highway was unremarkable. Somewhere along that route, the world shifted in ways no one could see. Back in Bakersfield, the hours passed without incident. Esther went about her day. Margarita thought about calling Marina but decided to wait. There was no reason to worry yet. Silence, at least at first, was not unusual. But silence has a way of changing. By the second day, the absence of a phone call felt noticeable. By the third, it felt uncomfortable. Marina had always checked in eventually. She might disappear for a bit, but she did not vanish completely. Days turned into a week. Then two. Questions began to form quietly at first. Where had Marina gone? Had she reached Ontario? Had something gone wrong with the car? Was she angry? Was she busy? Every possibility seemed more reasonable than the one no one wanted to say out loud. Our community knows this stage well. That moment when worry becomes something you carry in your chest. When you replay the last conversation, listening for clues that were not there at the time. When you tell yourself not to overreact because overreacting feels foolish if nothing is wrong. As the weeks passed, the worry hardened into something heavier. There were no confirmed sightings, no calls, no letters, no word passed through friends or extended family. Marina did not show up anywhere she was expected. The explanation that she had simply moved on began to wear thin. By early December, Marina's family could no longer ignore what felt wrong, but they were trapped by uncertainty. Marina was an adult. She had left voluntarily. There was no obvious sign of danger. Without evidence of harm, there was little for authorities to act on. And then, hundreds of miles away, another ordinary day began. It was a cool December day near the coast. The air carried the smell of salt and damp concrete. Colonia Park in Oxnard was quiet, the kind of place families visited without thinking twice. A passerby walked near the public restrooms, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. Then he heard it. The sound cut through the usual background noise, not laughter, not conversation, crying. High, insistent, unmistakable cries that echoed off tiled walls. It was the sound of babies who had been crying for too long. The man hesitated, then asked a woman nearby to check the women's restroom. She pushed the door open and froze. On the wet tile floor lay two infant girls. No adults, no bags, no explanation. Just two children crying, their faces flushed, their bodies cold against the hard surface. Police were called immediately. The girls were taken from the restroom and wrapped in warmth. Officers estimated their ages. One was just over a year old. The other was barely more than a newborn. They were hungry, frightened, but alive. There were no obvious signs of injury. Nothing that explained why they had been left alone. Witnesses were asked questions. Some remembered a dark pickup truck earlier in the day. Others recalled a woman nearby. Details were vague. No one could say where the children had come from or where the adults had gone. The girls were taken into protective care. Paperwork was started. Forms were filled out. Temporary names were assigned. Their history began not with birth announcements or family photographs, but with official records and unanswered questions. Back in Bakersfield, Marina's family had no idea this had happened. They did not know that two babies had been found alone in a park restroom. They did not know that the ages matched. They did not know that somewhere their search had already intersected with another story. They only knew that Marina had not come back. By mid-December, the fear that something was seriously wrong could no longer be ignored. Margarita tried calling every number she had. Esther retraced the last day again and again, searching her memory for something she might have missed. Did Marina hesitate before leaving? Did she look back? Did she say anything that sounded like a goodbye? Nothing surfaced. Our community understands this helplessness. The way questions multiply when answers do not come. The way time becomes an enemy, stretching out the space between what was known and what is feared. As the year drew to a close, Marina Ramos was officially missing in the hearts of her family, even if no document yet said so. Elizabeth and Jasmine were missing too, though no one in Bakersfield knew they were being cared for by strangers miles away. Two stories were unfolding at the same time, unaware of each other, moving forward on separate tracks. By the time anyone realized that Marina had not simply left town, the distance between those tracks had grown wide, and the ordinary day she walked out the door had already turned into something else entirely. As the months stretched into years, Marina Ramos's disappearance stopped feeling like an emergency to the outside world, even as it continued to shape every quiet moment for the people who loved her, because time has a way of smoothing sharp edges for those who are not directly cut by them, while leaving the wound open for those who are. The investigation never officially ended, but it drifted into a kind of suspended animation, reviewed, occasionally mentioned in passing, but rarely moved forward with any real expectation of resolution. And each time the family was contacted, the conversation sounded much the same as the last: polite, but restrained, hopeful, but careful not to promise what could not be delivered. For Margarita, Marina's sister, the passage of time did not soften anything. It only rearranged the pain into something more manageable, something she could carry without falling apart, even though it never truly went away. Birthdays came and went, each one marked quietly, sometimes with a small cake that no one really felt like eating, sometimes with nothing more than a whispered acknowledgement that Marina would have been another year older, that Elizabeth would have been learning new words, that Jasmine would have been taking her first steps somewhere, somehow, if the world had unfolded the way it was supposed to. Esther continued to replay that last morning in her mind, not obsessively but persistently, as if the memory itself might eventually reveal something new if she looked at it from enough angles, even though it never did. Marina's voice in the doorway, the way she held the girls, the casual certainty with which she spoke about leaving all of it, remained stubbornly ordinary, and that ordinariness became its own kind of torment because there was nothing dramatic to explain what followed, no raised voice or sudden fear that could be pointed to as the moment everything went wrong. Our community understands this stage of loss, the long middle where there are no answers and no clear direction, where the initial urgency has faded but the questions remain unanswered and unanswerable, settling into daily life like background noise that never quite goes away. This is the part no one prepares you for, the years where hope does not disappear but changes shape, becoming quieter, heavier, something you carry privately rather than speak aloud. As time passed, Marina's name appeared less frequently in conversations with law enforcement, not because anyone had given up entirely, but because there was nothing new to say, and in the absence of new information, repetition began to feel pointless, even cruel. The file sat where it always had, thin and frustrating, containing little more than a timeline built from memory and a name that led nowhere, and each review ended the same way, with a quiet acknowledgement that without fresh leads there was nowhere else to look. Meanwhile, life continued elsewhere, moving forward in ways that felt almost offensive to those still waiting. Children grew older. Technology advanced. Systems improved. The world did not pause for unanswered questions. And somewhere beyond Bakersfield, two young girls were growing up, their lives unfolding in a way that had nothing to do with missing persons reports or unresolved investigations, even though the shadow of that beginning lingered in subtle ways neither of them could fully explain. They grew up knowing they had been found, that much was clear, but found by whom, and left by whom remained unanswered, and those unanswered questions shaped them differently as they aged, settling into their personalities in ways that felt more like instincts than memories. One of them learned early to hold on to fragments, bits of information, scraps of paper that hinted at a life before the one she knew, while the other carried a quieter, heavier uncertainty, a belief that something fundamental had been taken from her before she was old enough to remember it. Back in Bakersfield, Margarita tried to keep Marina present in the only ways she could, speaking her name, often telling stories about her stubbornness and her determination, refusing to let her become just another photograph tucked into a drawer. Even when people around her began to speak less and less about the disappearance, as if silence itself might be a kindness. It was not. Silence only made the absence louder. Our community knows that time does not heal this kind of wound. It only changes how it feels, dulling the sharpest edges while leaving a constant ache behind, a reminder that something is missing and may never be recovered. It is a grief without ceremony, without closure, one that does not allow for the rituals that help other losses make sense. Years turned into decades, and Marina Ramos became a name associated with uncertainty rather than urgency. A case referenced occasionally but rarely discussed in detail, while her family learned how to live with the unanswered questions, how projectors, how BSQ now wait, to function without resolution, how to accept that the world might never explain what had happened on that ordinary morning in late summer. And yet, even as the case settled into the category people refer to as cold, it was never truly dormant, because the evidence had not disappeared and neither had the questions. They waited quietly for a moment when someone would look at them differently, when the story that no longer made sense might finally be re-examined with fresh eyes. The waiting, though exhausting, was not entirely without purpose, even if no one could see it yet, because time was changing more than just memories. It was changing the tools available to those willing to look again, and somewhere buried, beneath years of silence and assumption, the truth was still intact, untouched by the passing decades. The family did not know when that truth would surface, or how, or what it would bring with it. But they held on to one certainty with quiet determination. Marina had not simply vanished without reason, and whatever had happened after she walked out that door had not been the life she had planned for herself or her daughters. That belief, fragile as it sometimes felt, was enough to keep the story from ending there. It began, as so many turning points do, not with urgency or drama, but with a decision that felt almost routine to the person making it, even though it would eventually alter the course of a story that had been drifting for decades without direction. The file bearing Marina Ramos's name had been reviewed before, set aside before, and returned to the shelf with the same quiet resignation each time. Yet on this particular morning, in an office that looked like every other office in a county building, someone chose not to put it back just yet. The investigator assigned to review the case had not expected to find anything remarkable. The folder was thin, its pages yellowed at the edges, the kind of file that carried more absence than information. And as she sat at her desk, turning the pages slowly, she felt the familiar frustration of a case that seemed to have reached the end of what it could offer. There were no dramatic witness statements, no detailed timelines built from hard facts, no clear direction to follow, only a name, a vague departure, and a silence that stretched far beyond what anyone could reasonably explain. Still, something about the story refused to settle comfortably into the explanation it had been given all those years earlier, because even after time had dulled the urgency, The idea that a young mother would leave with two babies and never 22% reach out again, never confirm her safety, never ask for help, continued to feel incomplete, as if a crucial piece had been missing from the very beginning. The investigator leaned back slightly, eyes lingering on a detail that had been noted but never fully explored: the alias Marina had used during her brief encounter with the legal system earlier that year, a name that had once seemed insignificant, but now stood out simply because it was concrete, documented, traceable in a way so much else in the case was not. Aliases, she knew, were often used casually, sometimes out of convenience, sometimes out of fear, but they always left a paper trail, and paper trails had a way of surviving long after memories failed. She turned the page again, then paused, her finger resting on the margin as she reread the same line for the third time, not because it had changed, but because her understanding of it had. The fingerprints taken during that minor arrest had been filed, preserved, and then forgotten, not because they were unimportant, but because at the time there had been nowhere useful to send them. Databases were limited, connections were sparse, technology simply had not been ready. Now it was. The decision to resubmit the fingerprints did not feel heroic in the moment, and it was not accompanied by any sense of certainty, only a quiet recognition that the cost of trying was low, while the cost of not trying had already been paid. For decades, the investigator filled out the necessary forms, entered the request, and moved on to other tasks, fully expecting the result to come back the same way it always had, with nothing to report. Days passed without comment. The office returned to its usual rhythm. The Marina Ramos file remained open on the desk a little longer than usual, then was closed, not with finality but with patience. When the response finally arrived, it did not announce itself loudly. It appeared as a notification routine in appearance, easy to overlook if one was not paying close attention. The investigator opened it without expectation, scanning the information quickly at first, then more slowly, her breath catching just slightly, as she realized that this time the result was different. There was a match. Not to Marina Ramos, but to the name she had once used. The one that had seemed incidental until this moment, the name attached to a set of fingerprints taken years earlier, in a different context, now resurfacing with relevance that could not be ignored. The alias had led somewhere, after all, not to an answer, but to a door that had never been opened. The investigator sat very still, reading the details again, to be certain she had not misunderstood, because this was the kind of moment where assumptions could be dangerous, where hope could outrun evidence if allowed to. Only after confirming the information did she reach for the phone, aware that the next step mattered just as much as the discovery itself. The call she made was careful, measured, framed as a question rather than a declaration, because years of experience had taught her that certainty should never come before verification. When the person on the other end of the line answered, she introduced herself, explained why she was calling, and asked gently whether the name meant anything to them. There was a pause, not long, but long enough to feel weighted, followed by an answer that shifted the ground beneath the entire case. "No," the woman said, "but I have a cousin named Marina Ramos, who hasn't been seen since that time." The words landed quietly, without emphasis, yet they carried a clarity the case had never known, because for the first time in decades, Marina Ramos was no longer a theory or a possibility, but a confirmed identity connected to a tangible record, a person who had existed in more than one place, under more than one name. The investigator thanked the woman, ended the call, and sat back in her chair, staring at the wall for a moment longer than necessary, not out of disbelief but out of recognition, because she understood immediately that the story she was working on was larger than the file in front of her, larger than a single disappearance, larger even than the question of where Marina had gone. If Marina had been identified through an alias, then everything that followed her departure needed to be re-examined. Not just the missing person report, but the assumptions that had shaped it, the decisions that had been made because of it, and the silences that had been allowed to persist. The next call was harder. When the investigator reached out to Marina's family, she chose her words carefully, explaining first that new information had come to light, that a long-standing question had finally been answered, and that Marina had been located not in the way anyone would have hoped, but with certainty at last. There was relief in the family's voices, even through the shock, because knowing, however painful, was something they had waited for far longer than they ever should have had to. Then came the question that no one had anticipated, not because it was illogical, but because it revealed just how incomplete the investigation had been for so long. Where are her girls? The room seemed to hold its breath. The investigator had no answer for that yet, only the sudden, undeniable understanding that the disappearance of Marina Ramos had never been a single story, and that somewhere along the way 2 lives had slipped through the cracks entirely. Not because they were invisible, but because no one had known to look for them. From that moment forward, the focus of the case shifted, expanding outward instead of inward, as new timelines were drawn, old records revisited, and agencies that had never communicated before were asked to sit at the same table. Reports from different jurisdictions were pulled, names, compared, dates aligned, and patterns began to emerge where there had once been only coincidence. It became clear, slowly at first, and then with growing urgency, that the question was no longer whether Marina's story had been misunderstood, but how many other pieces had been misplaced along with it, and what it would take to bring them back into alignment. Our community knows this moment, the one where a long-standing mystery does not resolve itself all at once, but instead cracks open, revealing that the truth has layers, each one demanding patience, humility, and the willingness to admit that what once seemed settled never truly was. The search that followed was different from the one that had come before, not driven by desperation but by purpose, informed by technology that did not exist when Marina first disappeared, and guided by a question that now had real weight behind it. If Marina Ramos had not simply vanished, then neither had her daughters. The only remaining question was where they had gone, and whether time had carried them too far away to be found. Once the question had been spoken out loud, "Where are her girls?" it could not be taken back, and it changed the shape of every conversation that followed, because it forced everyone involved to confront a truth that had been hiding in plain sight for decades, that Marina Ramos's story had never been just about one missing woman, but about 2 children, whose lives had been redirected so completely that even their absence had gone unnoticed by those searching for their mother. The investigator began where she could not with assumptions but with records, because records, unlike memories, did not soften or distort with time. She requested files from agencies that had never before been connected to Marina's case, pulling reports from counties hundreds of miles apart, reading intake forms, witness statements, and handwritten notes from a different era, when information was captured on paper and stored in boxes rather than databases. The work was slow, methodical, and at times deeply frustrating, because so many of the documents had been created without the knowledge that they might one day need to speak to one another. As the days passed, patterns began to surface, not dramatic ones, but small consistencies that taken together formed a picture that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. Dates aligned in ways that felt uncomfortable. Ages matched too closely to ignore. Locations that had once seemed unrelated now appeared as points on the same map, separated by distance but connected by time. There was a child abandonment report from Southern California filed in mid-December of the same year Marina had vanished, describing 2 infant girls found alone in a public restroom, their ages estimated at just over a year and only a few weeks old. At the time, no missing children report had been linked to them, and without names or identifying information, the case had been closed once the children were placed into care. It had remained there dormant for decades. The investigator read the report carefully, then read it again, paying attention to details that might once have seemed incidental. The estimated ages, the description of the vehicle witnesses believed they had seen nearby, the presence of a woman and 2 men at the scene. None of it constituted proof on its own, but together it created a thread that could not be ignored. Still, caution was necessary. Hope had derailed investigations before, and no one wanted to place weight on a connection that could not be supported by evidence. The next step required patience, and more importantly, cooperation from people who had no reason to expect that their lives were about to intersect with a decades-old case. The decision to pursue genetic genealogy was made quietly, without fanfare, because it was still a relatively new tool, powerful but not infallible, capable of offering possibilities rather than certainty. Family members of Marina Ramos were contacted and asked whether they would be willing to provide samples, not with promises of answers but with honesty about the process and its limitations. They agreed without hesitation, because after so many years of not knowing, the chance of clarity, however small, was worth the risk of disappointment. The waiting that followed was different from the waiting they had endured before. It was no longer an empty silence, but a charged one filled with the knowledge that something was happening, even if no one could yet say what it would lead to. Weeks passed, marked by careful updates and restrained expectations, until finally a result appeared that shifted the balance from possibility to probability. There was a match. Not a definitive answer, not yet, but a strong indication that someone living under a different name shared a significant genetic connection to the Ramos family. The woman was an adult now living an ordinary life, unaware that her history extended beyond the story she had always been told. When investigators reached out to her, they did so carefully mindful of the impact such a call could have, because no one answers the phone expecting to learn that their identity may not be what they believed it to be. The conversation unfolded slowly, with questions asked gently, answers offered hesitantly, until one detail emerged that caused the investigator to sit forward in her chair, heart beating just a little faster than before. The woman explained that she and her sister had been found as infants abandoned in a public place in Southern California, and that they had been adopted shortly afterward, raised together in a home that had loved them and given them stability, even as questions about their origins lingered in the background of their lives. The investigator asked where the adoption had taken place and when. The dates aligned. She asked whether there were any records, any documents, any pieces of paper that might still exist from that time. There was a pause, followed by an answer that felt almost too fragile to hold. "I kept some clippings," the woman said, "from the newspaper. I don't know why. I just did." Those clippings, yellowed with age, became the bridge between two stories that had been waiting decades to meet. They described two babies found alone, cared for by strangers, their origins unknown. When compared with the original police report from the time, the match was undeniable. The next step was confirmation, the kind that leaves no room for doubt, because in cases like this, belief must be anchored in certainty. Arrangements were made quietly. Samples were collected. Tests were conducted with the care such moments demand, because the results would not only answer a question but reshape lives. When the confirmation came, it did not arrive with celebration or relief, but with a profound stillness, the kind that follows a truth too large to be absorbed all at once. Elizabeth and Jasmine Ramos were alive. They had been alive all along, growing up under different names, building lives that had unfolded without knowledge of the family, that had never stopped wondering where they were. For Margarita, the news landed in layers. First came the shock, then the relief, then the grief for everything that had been lost in between. She had spent years imagining her sister somewhere out there, struggling, surviving, raising her children against all odds. Now she knew that Marina had not survived, and that the girls she had worried about had grown up without knowing who they were or where they came from. Our community understands this kind of resolution, the kind that answers questions while creating new ones, the kind that brings relief and sorrow together in a way that cannot be separated. Knowing is not the same as healing, and finding someone does not undo the years spent without them. When the sisters were told the truth, they responded differently, as people often do when confronted with information that reshapes their understanding of themselves. One felt a release she had not known she needed, because the belief that she had been abandoned by choice had weighed on her for as long as she could remember. The other approached the news more cautiously, protective of the life she had built, grateful for the clarity but wary of the pain that came with it. They learned their mother's name. They learned how she had lived and how she had died. They learned that what they had believed about their beginnings was incomplete, not because anyone had lied to them, but because the truth had been buried by time and circumstance. The investigation did not end with their identification, because there were still questions that demanded answers. Questions about who had been with Marina when she disappeared, who had been seen with the children when they were abandoned, and why no one had ever come forward. The focus shifted again back toward accountability, even as the family began the slow work of reconciling the past with the present. For the first time in more than 3 decades, the story of Marina Ramos was whole enough to be told not as a mystery without end, but as a narrative shaped by loss, persistence, and the quiet determination of people who refused to let it disappear entirely. And yet, even as one chapter closed, another remained unfinished, because the truth once uncovered has a way of demanding more, asking not only to be known, but to be understood. Once the initial shock settled into something quieter and more manageable, the work of living with the truth began, and it was a kind of work no one could have prepared for, because knowing what happened did not erase the years that had passed in between, nor did it restore what had been lost. While the Family waited often without even realizing what they were waiting for. For Marina's relatives, the confirmation of her fate brought a strange combination of relief and sorrow, because certainty, even painful certainty, offered something they had not had before, an end to imagining endless possibilities. Margarita no longer had to picture her sister somewhere far away, struggling in silence, or wonder whether a knock at the door might someday bring unexpected answers. Marina's story now had an ending, even if it was not the one anyone would have chosen. And that finality allowed grief to take a more honest shape. Grief, once allowed to exist openly, does not move in a straight line, and Margarita found herself cycling through emotions she had assumed she had already processed years earlier, feeling anger that had nowhere to go, sadness that settled deep and stayed there, and moments of guilt for the ordinary, happiness she had allowed herself, while her sister's fate remained unknown. There was no single moment of acceptance, only a gradual understanding that healing would come in fragments gathered slowly, often unexpectedly. For Elizabeth and Jasmine, the process was different because the truth did not simply add information to their lives, it reshaped the foundation on which those lives had been built. They had grown up believing a version of their own beginnings that now felt incomplete, and adjusting to that knowledge required time, patience, and a willingness to sit with discomfort rather than push it away. Therapy became part of that process, not as a cure, but as a space where questions could be asked safely, where feelings that had never quite made sense before could finally be named. One of the sisters spoke openly about the sense of release that came with learning that their mother had not chosen to leave them, that the abandonment she had internalized as a reflection of her own worth was instead the result of circumstances beyond her control. That understanding did not erase the pain of being left alone in a public place as a child, but it reframed it, allowing compassion to replace blame in a way that felt profoundly freeing. The other sister approached the truth more cautiously, holding it at arm's length at first, because her life as she knew it had been built carefully and intentionally, and she was not ready to let that structure be shaken too violently. She acknowledged the facts, accepted the connection, but chose to move slowly, honoring both the family she had grown up with and the family she was only just beginning to understand. Our community knows that healing is rarely symmetrical, even among people who share the same experience, because each person carries their own history into the present, shaping how they receive and respond to new information. There is no correct pace for acceptance, no universal timeline for reconciliation, and no requirement that clarity must arrive all at once. As the sisters navigated their relationship with their biological family, care was taken to avoid pressure or expectation, because reunions, especially those shaped by long separation and loss, are rarely the joyful conclusions imagined by one day. Those watching from the outside, meetings were planned thoughtfully, often with professional support present, and conversations were allowed to unfold without urgency, acknowledging that trust, like grief, develops gradually. For Margarita, meeting her nieces was both a gift and a reminder of what had been missed, because she could see traces of Marina in them, small expressions, familiar gestures, moments of recognition that arrived unexpectedly and left her breathless. At the same time, she was keenly aware of the years that could not be reclaimed, the birthdays that had passed without celebration, the milestones that had been reached without family present to witness them. The sisters, for their part, found themselves balancing gratitude with sadness, appreciating the stability they had been given while mourning the absence of a relationship they never had the chance to build. They learned about Marina through stories, photographs, and shared memories, constructing an understanding of their mother piece by piece, knowing it would never be complete, but finding value in what could still be known. Legal matters were addressed quietly and respectfully, with attention paid to preserving the lives the sisters had already built, rather than disrupting them unnecessarily. Their adoptions remained intact, a recognition that the love and care they had received were real and meaningful even as their original identities were acknowledged and restored. Documentation was updated where possible, records amended to reflect the truth, providing the sisters with access to medical history and family information that had long been missing. Meanwhile, the investigation into Marina's death continued, shaped now by a clearer understanding of the timeline and the individuals involved. Witness descriptions were revisited. Old reports were examined again with fresh context. The focus narrowed to those who had been seen with Marina and the children in the days leading up to their disappearance, and while definitive answers remained elusive, the case was no longer defined by absence alone. Our community understands that justice does not always arrive in the form of arrests or trials, and that accountability can remain unfinished, even when truth is uncovered. This reality does not diminish the value of persistence. Rather, it highlights its importance, reminding us that the pursuit of answers is meaningful, even when outcomes remain uncertain. As time passed, the family settled into a new normal, one shaped by connection rather than waiting, by conversation rather than speculation. Holidays were no longer marked by unanswered questions alone, but by shared experiences, cautious at first, then gradually more comfortable as relationships deepened. The sisters began to feel less like figures from a story they had inherited, and more like participants in a family that was still learning how to be whole. There were setbacks, moments when old beliefs resurfaced unexpectedly, when grief felt as sharp as it ever had. But these moments were met with understanding rather than frustration, because everyone involved recognized that healing does not move in a straight line. It bends, pauses, sometimes circles back on itself, and that is not failure, but part of the process. For Margarita, the knowledge that Marina's name had been restored, that her daughters were safe and living full lives, provided a measure of peace that had once seemed impossible. She spoke often of the importance of keeping Marina's story alive, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to the impact of persistence and the value of refusing to let a person disappear into silence. Our community knows that stories like this do not end neatly, because life rarely offers clean conclusions, but they do offer something else, something perhaps more enduring, a reminder that truth, even delayed, has the power to reconnect what was once separated, and that attention, care, and determination can bridge gaps that once seemed unthinkable. As the family continued forward, carrying both loss and connection with them, they did so with an awareness that the years spent apart could not be undone, but that the years ahead still held meaning, still offered opportunities for understanding, and still allowed for the kind of healing that comes not from forgetting the past, but from finally seeing it clearly. Years later, when the dust of the investigation had finally settled into something quieter, Elizabeth and Jasmine found themselves living in a world that now contained more truth than it once had, even though that truth had arrived far later than it ever should have. They were adults by then, with routines, relationships, and responsibilities shaped by lives that had unfolded without knowledge of their origins. And yet, once the truth entered those lives, it did not remain a distant fact, but slowly wove itself into the fabric of who they were becoming. They spoke their mother's name aloud, sometimes hesitantly, sometimes with growing familiarity, learning how it sounded in their own voices, learning what it meant to carry a connection that had been denied to them for so long. Marina Ramos was no longer an abstract figure or a question mark at the beginning of their story. She was a real person, with a history, a family, and a life that had ended too soon, and knowing that changed how they understood themselves in ways that were subtle but profound. For Margarita, the years that followed were marked by a different kind of remembrance, one no longer fueled solely by uncertainty but grounded in knowledge. She spoke of her sister not as someone who might return someday, but as someone who had existed fully and deserved to be remembered accurately, without speculation or distortion. Marina's name appeared in conversations again, not whispered, not tentative, but present, anchored in truth rather than absence. The case itself began to take on a life beyond the family, referenced in discussions about missing persons, about unidentified remains, about the consequences of systems that once operated in isolation rather than cooperation. It was cited not as a cautionary tale meant to frighten, but as an example of how persistence, evidence, preservation, and the willingness to revisit old assumptions could restore identities thought lost forever. Changes followed quietly, without ceremony. Databases began to speak to one another more readily. Information sharing between jurisdictions improved. The idea that a missing adult and unidentified children could exist in separate systems without connection was no longer accepted as inevitable, but recognized as a failure that could and should be addressed. Marina Ramos's case became part of that shift, one among many, but no less significant for the family who had lived inside it for decades. Our community knows that progress often arrives this way, not with sweeping reform announced from podiums, but through the accumulation of lessons learned from individual lives, each one reminding us of what happens when attention lapses and what becomes possible when it returns. The lessons of this story are not dramatic, but they are enduring. They remind us that persistence is not loud and that hope does not always announce itself with certainty. Sometimes hope looks like a file reopened after years on a shelf, or a fingerprint preserved long enough to matter, or a family that continues to say a name even when no one else does. They remind us, too, that community vigilance is not about suspicion, but about care, about noticing when something does not make sense, and allowing ourselves to ask questions even when those questions feel uncomfortable. A woman leaving town with two babies should not have become an unsolvable mystery, and the fact that it did speaks not to individual failure but to the limitations of a system that has since learned slowly and imperfectly how to do better. For those listening who have lived long enough to remember a world before instant communication, before information traveled effortlessly across distance, this story may feel painfully familiar. It belongs to a time when silence could stretch for years without explanation, when missing people simply faded from public view, and when families were left to carry unanswered questions alone. But it also belongs to the present, because the work of paying attention is never finished. Our community understands that it is not being intrusive to notice when something feels wrong, and it is not overreacting to speak up when concern arises. It is an act of care, a responsibility shared by those who understand that harm often hides behind ordinary appearances, and that attention once given can change the course of a life. If there is a practical lesson here, it is this: keep records, keep asking questions, and do not assume that time alone will resolve what silence has obscured. Support organizations that help families search. Stay connected to cases even after public interest fades. Remember that behind every file number is a person whose absence reshaped the lives of others. And perhaps most importantly, remember that identities matter. Names matter. Saying them aloud, preserving them, insisting they be remembered accurately is not an act of nostalgia, but one of justice. The story of Marina Ramos began with an ordinary morning, a woman walking out the door with her children believing she was stepping into a new life. For years, that moment stood frozen, unanswered, surrounded by silence. The question of how someone could vanish so completely haunted those who were left behind, lingering without resolution. When the answer finally came, it did not erase the pain of the years spent waiting, nor did it restore what had been lost, but it did something else, something quieter and more lasting. It returned a name to a woman who had been reduced to absence, and it returned truth to daughters who had lived without it for far too long. Our community knows that not every story ends with justice neatly served or grief neatly resolved. Some stories end with understanding, instead with the knowledge that even after decades of silence, truth can still surface and connections can still be restored if someone is willing to look again. Because in the end, Marina Ramos was not found by accident, nor were her daughters reunited with their history by chance. They were found because people paid attention, because evidence was preserved, and because persistence, quiet and unrelenting, refused to let a life disappear without acknowledgement. And that perhaps is the light this story leaves behind, the understanding that even in the longest silence, someone is still listening, someone is still searching, and someday when the time is right, the truth will speak.